I give the stage to Claudio for his 5-minute talk. I don't need to introduce you again.
I don't need to laugh. I'll try to do it.
Okay.
Okay, so this is not a science talk. It really is about context around the work that we've done with the Big Data Institute, and give you some examples of how we've integrated it in some of our work and why it's important. And in marine systems, really, we are concerned mostly with ballast and biofouling on the hulls. And ballast is, typically we think of that as ballast water. I've heard that a lot, but it does include ballast sediments as well. Just sort of keep that in mind. In the 1980s, this whole issue of vectors exchanging and managing ballast and trying to understand the role of vessels in this came to light. This is the zebra mussel, bottom right-hand corner, was introduced from Europe and Ponto-Caspian area to the Great Lakes, caused tremendous problems with fouling, everything from sewage lines, water lines, boats, pretty much anything in water got coated in these things. Caused a lot of economic and ecological hazards and issues to the system. And back in the 80s, they thought that implementing something called mid-ocean exchange could solve this problem. The idea was that you pick up this freshwater species as the ship is crossing the ocean, where I have that circled in blue. You would pick up marine salty water that would kill any freshwater species in that boat, and then they could dump that marine water in the lake system, and you would reduce dramatically the stress. And in fact, that is what happened. There have been very few introductions since the implementation of the ocean exchange. It hasn't been quite as successful in the marine system because picking up coastal water and dumping it in coastal water, there's less of a discrepancy in that salinity, and so we've had multiple introductions. But from my perspective, if you look on this coastal site, I'm really interested in what you do with once a non-native species has been introduced to the coast. And traditionally, it's been thought that once it gets here, because of natural processes, that species is going to spread up and down the coast, and there's not much you can do. And I don't think that that's actually the case. So we started a project about 3.5 years ago, to try to address and model this system. And these are 3 highly schematic components, and I'm just going to highlight and then give you an example with real data. The left panel is some suitable habitat modeling we do. We do this for individual species, and we do it for groups of species, and it tells us where the species are located. And in the middle panel, and we can do that, we were talking earlier about climate change and environmental variability. We can look at how the distribution of species will change from present day into the long term, so 50, 100-year time scale, and say where the species will go. And in the middle panel is some biological connectivity. So we use Lagrangian particle tracking, for example, to look at how species get from areas. So say down here, So for example, how species get from down here, where can they disperse? Can they get into the Gulf of St. Lawrence? Can they get to Newfoundland? And modeling that natural dispersal allows us to draw lines in the ocean. So these red lines, which we call biogeographic barriers, these are lines that effectively demarcate the ocean where natural dispersal cannot happen. So in this case, we have that red line. Individuals from here cannot disperse. It would seep into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and into Newfoundland, and I'll show you some evidence for that. So the final piece is the vessel traffic analysis. If you know that there are these barriers to natural dispersal, then presumably the only thing that is mitigating that transport or compromising those natural barriers to dispersal are anthropogenic factors that I just showed you. And vessel traffic is a big one. So this is just an example from the work we've been doing. Here is the present day hotspot distribution of about 25 non-indigenous species on the east coast of Canada. And what you see is they're concentrated, the red areas are the concentrated, the most species in the New England area, getting into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and even southwest Nova Scotia, which seems comparable in climatology to New England. So it all makes sense. You have much fewer of those species showing up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. If we did a projection to 2100, and we can see a total shift. Now this is dramatic by all stretches. It's a long time scale, 80 years or so. and it's RCP 8.5 for people who recognize that that's a worst case scenario in IPCC climate modeling work. But what I'll say is even those projections, which are 1 to 2 degrees Celsius change on this time frame, are things that we're already seeing across this region. We live in an area that has been experiencing interannually anomalous temperatures on the order of 2, 4, even 6 temporally and spatially sometimes. So those short-term changes that we're seeing are reflective of these long-term projections as well. So the range expansion, I don't think anybody argues with that as real. So if we couple some of the particle track modeling, and this has just recently been published, it's a study led by Kira Krauthansel, who's sitting here, so if you have a question, by all means. And I'm just focusing on one small area. And what you can see is the particle track modeling, once you include the biology of some of these taxonomic groups, is basically out of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and it's southward from Newfoundland down along the shelf. So this is an area that we don't expect to see a lot of natural dispersal. So this, to us, highlights an area where mitigation measures are ideal. So if you're going to manage vessels in an area like the east coast of Canada, you don't want to have to cover that whole area, right? You want to be able to go in and know where you need to focus your efforts for management. So that's really what this study was about. This is just to give you a scope of the study. Not only did we do on the mid-Atlantic into the high Arctic on the east coast, but on the west coast here on the right, we also did similar latitudinal range in the Pacific. And so the study talks about and lays this all out very nicely. This is just to show you some of the really rough, coarse results from the particle track modeling on the left. Here you can see the direction. And the thing I want you to notice is that it's mostly unidirectional from north to south. Most physical oceanographers appreciate this. But what that means for our coast is that we have a really good opportunity to prevent dispersal, of organisms into the coast. They go so fast. Good thing I'm done. But then we can couple the vessel traffic analysis to this. So we can highlight the areas that require the most attention for mitigation. And this is just categorizing the types of vessels, so we can go into types of vessels. Yeah, just my acknowledgements.
Thank you, Claudio. Thank you very much. So the next speaker in session number 3 is Sarah Bailey. Sarah Bailey is going to join us online, and you can share your screen. Please,
okay.
Yeah, wonderful. Sarah is a senior research scientist at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Her research focuses on aquatic invasive species, vectors and pathways of introduction, risk assessment, and evaluating strategies to prevent introductions. Her research includes analysis of vessel tracking data to assess the risk of species introductions by ships.
Okay, great. You can hear me okay?
We can hear you okay.
Great.
You can share your slides now, or we can share them too if you don't have them ready.
Oh, I am sharing, so.
We can't see them right now.
Right, let me try again. And do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so yeah, thank you for the invitation to participate. I'm really excited about this project going forward. And my presentation is more of a wish list as an end user of some future products, or as an individual scientist, because this is the processing of AIS data is not really my area of expertise. So we've heard a little bit just from Claudio now about ballast water and biofouling. So this is just some data collected for the last 50 years showing different mechanisms for introduction of aquatic species around the world. And we can see in green the ballast water and yellow ship biofouling. Those are two of the most important pathways globally for introducing species. And on the right there, I have some photos of a ship discharging ballast water at sea. So ballast water is moved between different ports, whereas biofouling is just the accumulation of animals or plants attached to the ship hulls, which is shown down in the bottom here. So the work I do as a researcher with DFO is, I guess, associated with developing advice for Transport Canada, who manages shipping activities. And so a lot of the research we do is looking at assessing the risk. So trying to predict the probability that new species will arrive, trying to figure out which species will be transported. And if those that get transported, will they be able to survive or establish when they get introduced to a Canadian port? And also looking at the relative importance of different vectors or pathways. So comparing ballast water and biofouling and looking at ships arriving to different parts of Canada. So the data that we can get from AIS can be very helpful with assessing the risk of ballast water and biofouling. Of course, the best thing would be to collect samples of ballast water or biofouling and actually measure the organisms that are being moved in ships, but it's not practical to do that for the thousands of vessel arrivals that Canada receives in a year. So some of the factors that we look at to try and assess risk have to do with assessing the number of ballast water discharges or the volume of ballast water discharge, and then applying some assumptions about how many organisms are being transported in that ballast water based on things like voyage length, looking at the environmental conditions between the source and recipient ports to try and understand survival probability, and then looking at ballast water management actions. So for ballast water, a lot of the risk assessment is based on data that are self-reported by ships. They're required to submit information on their ballast water activities to Transport Canada, but AIS can be used to verify some of that self-reported data. So what port are they coming from? We've heard a little bit earlier today about looking at where they're doing ballast water exchange and mapping their transits, that kind of information. But actually, I think for biofouling, the AIS data is even more important because ballast water may not necessarily match the last port of call for different ships. We would have to make assumptions about, with each stop, whether a ship is loading or discharging ballast water. But with biofouling, each location that a ship visits is important for assessing the risk. If they have visited a variety of ports in different ecoregions, that can influence the diversity of species that they carry. And looking at the duration of stay, so how long they stop in different locations is important for assessing risk, because that can influence the accumulation or the deposition of species in each location. And things like sailing speed are also important. There's currently no reporting requirements associated with ship biofouling, and so AIS would be one of the main data sources that we would look to try and assess the risk of biofouling. So some of the data needs. In contrast to what I think I've heard a little bit today, I would actually say that it's been quite easy to access the raw AIS satellite data, and it's relatively easy to either hire or collaborate with people who can process those data. And in fact, I think because it is so relatively easy, that's why we see a lot of duplication within DFO. We have a lot of people acquiring data and processing data instead of doing it in one effort together. And that duplication also occurs across federal departments. So I know this project is DFO funded, but there are scientists at Environment Canada who are doing the exact same work we are doing. It's just that they're looking at air emissions or scrubber wash water discharges instead of invasive species. So what I think has been more difficult is that within DFO, my experience has been there's severe limitations with respect to using open access software, cloud-based applications. We have a lot of security restrictions that are quite difficult to overcome. And so I'm really excited about having some of this opportunity to work with external partners who can do a lot of the processing outside of the government IT environment. And then we would have more access to sort of the products of the data. So looking for things like statistics or visualizations of ship arrivals at Canadian ports. So one of the earlier speakers today talked about looking at the edges or the ship transits. For the ballast water and biofouling, I'm actually more interested in the nodes. So where are they arriving and how long are they stationary at the different ports? So that idle time, thanks, I'm just wrapping up. That idle time that Lee talked about excluding would actually be one of the most important things that I would want to include. So yeah, I think there's a lot of products that could be useful, both looking at individual vessels and ports, but also patterns nationwide. And I'll wrap it up there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And the next speaker who's joining us is
Ruixin.
Ruixin. Go?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes,
She's
I'm
also
going to
joining
come
us.
here.
Thank you for joining us. She's a computer science master student at Memorial University of Newfoundland. Her specialization is in marine data analytics, specifically network analysis and vessel flow prediction, with the aim to assess the risk of biological invasion by non-indigenous aquatic species. Do you want to share your screen with us, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Doing that.
Perfect. We can see you and hear you well.
Great. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm Ruixin from Memorial University, and today I'm gonna talk about the. Sorry, one moment. Sorry, my computer is a bit stuck. So today I'm gonna share our recent project about the vessel flow prediction for the ballast water risk assessment. So why we want to use the vessel flow prediction for ballast water risk assessment? We know that ballast water reports from the ships are important source of data for many existing risk assessment tools. But when we reach a global scale, the acquisition of ballast reports can be quite limited, since many countries might have not yet reached the ballast water management agreement. So besides the ballast reports, we may get the ballast water transition from the vessel movement. If we can predict the number of vessels traveling between the port pairs, we will be able to approximate the ship intensity and then estimate the risk level of the route based on both the environmental distance and the shipping intensity between the port pairs. So for now, we transfer the ballast risk assessment to the vessel flow prediction question. So to make this happen, we exploit a model called deep gravity, which is originally used for generating flows for the population migration. The basic idea of deep gravity is to see how attractive one location is to another one, to make the population travel between them. And it has included multiple features. So in our case, for the vessel flow prediction, in addition to AIS data, we also introduced the global trade data, which may have a strong connection with the ship movement. So let's see our feature vector. Our feature vector includes the source and destination feature group, VI and VJ, and the geographical distance between them, and the annual trade volume in US dollars from the source port country to the destinations countries. And the port, I want to mention that the port features VI and VJ include the number of vessels that have visited the source and destination, and they are considered the population of these ports, which is very essential in the deep gravity model. And it also includes the betweenness centrality as a graph metric, which we calculate from the shipping network constructed from the port visits data. And the deep gravity is implemented in a neural network, and we can see the model structure here. The hidden layers have multiple generalized linear units. Then we have these feature vectors to calculate the probability of a vessel traveling from the source to the destination. And lastly, we multiply the probabilities with the total outflow of the source ports so that we can get the predicted number of flows. One thing I want to mention that the deep gravity is a multi-classification model, so too many destinations may give too many classes. So in the later experiments, we have changed the destination from the ports to the 16 geographical areas to reduce the number of classes. And then let's look at the performance of the prediction. We report the median, maximum, and minimum accuracies on the 10-foot cross-validation, and we can see the table here. Here, the accuracy is defined as the ratio of common parts of the predicted and the real flows. In general, the accuracy can hold the level around 73%. And we also inspect the feature importance by the Shapley value. The Shapley value indicates whether the feature contributes more or less to the predicted flow probability. And it can also show the direction of these features' impact on the predicted results. For example, a large export values, we can see at the, here, means a lot of exportation from the source to the destination. And this can result in the model predicting more flows. And for the distance at the bottom, a long distance can result less vessel flows. So the vertical line in the center split and indicate these points. The only thing that makes sense to me for now is the centrality. The between the centrality should indicate how important a port is by finding the shortest path.
Sorry.
It's okay. By finding the shortest path across the ports in the whole graph. I suppose the reason probably is we have used the weighted graph in the centrality calculation, so those important ports may not get a fair value, so we will fix this point soon. And then talking about the pros and cons, there's some defects in our experiment, like we didn't capture the temporal features. We know that the timing of ballast water in the tank and the seasonality of the environmental factors can both affect the results of risk assessment. So it's indeed important, but our approach is able to generate the vessel flow data for a future state or the condition which like missing the values without relying on the real-time AIS data by exploring the connection with other factors such as the global trade data that we have experimentally proved that it has a strong connection with the vessel's movement. Here is my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I want to thank Emilka and Gabriel for their supervision and support of this project. Thank you.
You're right.
Thank you very much. And now we have a chance to ask the speakers some questions. So maybe Claudio can come to the front, and Sarah and Ruixin can just leave your camera on so that we can, So, questions from the audience, from the room? Martin?
Your prediction of the model, the migration of the species, did you consider any effects of seasonal hurricane effects of that nature that may change that migration at all? Or?
All those models were, the shortest timescale was monthly, so monthly averages, so we wouldn't capture, we would capture something that happened in that time frame, but it would be smoothed out by, the non-hurricane or stochastic event over that 30 days, so minimized. Yeah. But we have talked about doing stuff like that. It's just the grand scheme of things, it's just really a lot of work for a little input, a little reward.
Not right now.
Not right now.
Thank you.
I'm just going to ask Claudio about you mentioned that southern Gulf of St. Lawrence, and it's kind of unique characteristics in that it doesn't exchange a lot with the remainder of the Eastern Canadian shelves largely. Talk about this sort of it as a special management area or something. Could you elaborate a little bit on just what you were getting at?
It's unidirectional, the exchange.
Okay.
So it tends to go from the Gulf south, and what that means is that if we have an invasion, and most of our invasions in Nova Scotia are actually coming from New England. So as things warm, we have range expansion of non-native species. But what we find is there's a couple areas that northern natural expansion is disrupted. And one, surprisingly, is right at the entrance of the Bay of Fundy on the north side of the Bay of Fundy. The circulation in there is quite intense because of the tides, and the archipelago around St. Andrews is designed so that most of the flow is going out all the time. But the one that's obvious, and the one that we would manage or mitigate, is to try to prevent ships that anthropogenically introduce things from New England or the south coast of Nova Scotia into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, taking advantage of that natural barrier. And effectively all those zones that I showed on the East Coast seem to work as natural barriers for northward movement. So there's multiple opportunities to disrupt that anthropogenic transfer going north, which is really important because as the Arctic and subarctic warm and traffic increases, all the things we've been talking about, we're going to increase the risk that Sarah's been talking about, whether it's ballast water or hull fouling, of getting things into there. And some of our SDM modeling has shown that we already have suitable habitat for some species in Hudson's Bay and parts of the subarctic, and interannual variability, and especially long-term climate change, expands that area dramatically in the coming 50 or 100 years. So it's really important to get on top of this now, like within the next couple of decades, I think. And we wouldn't have known any of that without Big Data Institute's contribution to this traffic.
Thank you.
Rui, I have a question for you. In your model, when you have a track that goes, let's say, from Canada to a country in Europe, and it passed by a tiny island, let's say like that, how do you know if that passage is just a passing by the island, or if it stopped there and you should consider that as part of your modeling? Do your model predict it?
Yeah, I got your question. So our data, we get the port visits data that each port records which ships have stayed on these ports. So we transfer this port visits data to the routes, let's say the shipping network. So in this case, we can get to know, so these ships are identified by the MMSI, let's say. So we can know the ships as long as the port has recorded the ships has stay on this port, so we can get to know it has already from the location, like it's like a point, it has arrived here. So let's say we cannot get to know, it's not like a tracking, it's not like tracking a ship from where to where, but it's more like we already get to know it has from the source to the destination for the ports.
Okay, thank you.
I have a general question, probably for you, Claudio. I'll speak up in case they can't hear me. Is there a coordination between the ballast water researchers in Canada? Like, is there a venue where they all meet, or are you funding the university people?
Yeah, I think that's actually more of a question for Sarah. She's really the ballast water expert in the echo, so I'll just pass it off.
Yep. Could you hear me, Sarah?
Yeah, so the question was, is there a venue for coordination?
No, for ballast water in Canada especially.
Yeah, so it's a pretty small group of people that work on this, and I would say we all know each other personally, and so we do meet up at different meetings and try and coordinate. But there used to be an NSERC network, Canadian Aquatic Invasive Species Network, which was kind of an official annual meeting, but since that funding ended, I think it's been sort of more loose as to when people are meeting.
Okay, I think I'm asking because similar to some other topics, you know, we're going to try to solicit what kind of AIS info you need for, you know, AIS DIS or DD. And we don't necessarily need to get the same answers from all the ballast water people, but presumably we get a coherent answer because they might come up with different things. So there'll be other target groups like that we're going to try to find group collectively what are the needs, you know. Thanks.
Okay.
I think we've had people online, but they.
Oh, they're dropped off. Anyone online who would like to ask something?
I would like to ask a quick question to Sarah and Claudio. If you see Rui's work, we are trying to predict the flows, and because our idea is to kind of model in advance how it's going to be, let's say, the vessel flow from port A to port B in a week from now, or maybe in a month from now. How far in advance you think it would be interesting to model the flow in a way that ports could be prepared to kind of act before some type of invasion could happen?
Sarah, I'm happy for you to take that, or we have another project which I can lean on a little bit. I know Sarah thinks about these a lot.
Yeah, I think it could be good seasonally to try and manage different vectors coming in, and I think monthly we could get sort of predictions just based on cargo planning, but I would think seasonally might be more informative in terms of like risk would change seasonally as well.
Yeah, it's very important. I think this question, it's always in the back of my mind because it's kind of important to know the time horizon that a port could act, right? So I think that's an interesting question because this will probably guide us in terms of what kind of models we could try in terms of forecasting the flow, right? So yeah, I will have this in mind in our next meeting with Gabriel because I think that's a very interesting thing we should consider.
I thought that was Amilcar. So I'll say that we've been doing some work with D&D where we're focused more on an event-based occurrence. So we have been looking for them at source zones and characterizing biofouling species. And the idea is that if a vessel is coming back and you are worried about high-risk species that have been identified in that area, then you can implement a number of strategies potentially to identify if you're carrying that species, and then go to a database that will sort of provide mitigation strategies for you, whether that is changing your path to sort of reduce the climate match and reduce the risk, or treat your vessel, etc. It's a really interesting approach where you're doing all the work on the front end, which I think is what Amilcar is suggesting, and have a series of decisions that you need to make at some point in time where you're going into a new area and you're potentially worried about presenting risk of introducing a species. So we can talk more about that and how that sort of fits in with the data processing as well.
Yeah, thank you. Should we move on?
Yes, of course. Thank you everyone.
Thank you.